the black and white fisheye security monitor for camera 4 suddenly jumped with heavy magnetic interference at 2:14 in the morning on October 18, 1988. I held my breath, one hand frozen over the controls of the video home system deck, as an enormous dark figure, nearly 10 feet tall, walked slowly into the gravel yard beneath the sickly yellow glow of the halogen floodlights. One hand dragged the body of a large gray wolf behind him without any visible effort. The Bigfoot didn't eat it. He didn't hide it. He walked straight toward the barrier at mine shaft number 7, carefully placed the dead wolf across the entrance, then raised his hair-covered face and looked directly into the camera. Those red reflecting eyes seemed to stare straight through the screen with one message: stop before it's too late. If you enjoy mysteries like this one, remember to like and subscribe to Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories so you don't miss the next story. At 11:45 that night, October 17, 1988, Black Ridge had already been quiet for 4 hours. The mine sat deep in the Bitterroot Range, inside a narrow valley of gray rock and black pine forest. During the day, the place was filled with engine noise and stone dust. At night, only rows of work lights, a few sheet metal buildings, and white fog crawling low across the gravel remained. The temperature had dropped below freezing. The plastic explosive blasting shift at 4:30 in the afternoon had ended long ago. The last haul truck had left the ore loading area before 8 that evening, and the only sounds left were metal contracting in the wold and the steady burn of the oil heater inside the security control room. Jack Mercer sat behind the watch desk with his work jacket still on, even though the heater was running. Before coming to Black Ridge, he had served with an Army engineering unit, so he was used to judging sounds by how they traveled through structures and where the force behind them might be coming from. Gary sat at the next desk checking vehicle logs and the internal radio. On the wall behind them hung a wooden shiftboard marked in chalk, and below it were a map of the mine, the blasting schedule, and a list of equipment that had to be powered down after the evening shift. Everything was normal until exactly 12:15 after midnight. The seismic recorder in the corner used a long paper roll moving beneath an ink stylus. Normally, after blasting hours, the line only trembled slightly from loose rock settling or maintenance vehicles moving somewhere far away. But at 12:15, the needle suddenly jerked left and returned to center. 12 seconds later, it jumped again. Gary thought a haul truck might still be running somewhere, but Jack was already on his feet before he finished the sentence. Both men watched the paper creep slowly over the roller. At almost exactly 12-second intervals, another short jagged mark appeared, each one nearly the same size, with none of the fading pattern that followed an explosion or a fresh rock collapse. Jack marked 3 consecutive pulses with a pencil, looked at the mechanical clock on the wall, and counted. 12 seconds. Another 12. Then another. He pulled the sensor diagrams from a desk drawer and compared the locations of the instruments. The strongest signal came from the cluster mounted near the northern gravel yard, directly above mine shaft number 7. Based on the distance and the delay between recording stations, Jack estimated that the vibration wasn't coming from the surface. It was rising from somewhere deep underground, at least more than 300 feet down. He didn't call it a heartbeat, but the image still came into his mind because the pulses were so steady, like mechanical knocking coming through a thick layer of stone. Jack walked to the wooden shiftboard and checked every line of white chalk. The steam-powered crawler excavator at the north yard had shut down at 7:42 that evening. The rotary drill at shaft number 7 had its main breaker cut at exactly 8 o'clock, and the disconnect locked according to procedure. The crusher, conveyors, concrete plant, and hoist were all scheduled to remain off overnight. Gary called the mine's power station to ask whether any backup motor had started. The answer was no. Jack checked the electrical panel again. If a large machine had started on its own, The power load would have risen before the ground began vibrating. The meter was flat. At 12:25, the pressure sensor alarm along the northern fence gave one short, dry blast. The light marked N3 came on and went out. 10 minutes later, N5 triggered. At 12:45, N8 followed. Those sensors were mechanically attached to the fence posts to detect vehicle impacts, climbing, or strong vibration close to the perimeter. The cameras showed nothing but fog, gravel, and an empty fence line. Gary guessed the system was giving false alarms, but Jack didn't agree. There was almost no wind, and the sensors were triggering progressively westward, as though the vibration were traveling through the ground. About every 10 minutes, another alarm sounded from a different location, short and sharp, then stopped. By 1:15 in the morning, Jack had filled almost half a notebook page with times, sensor codes, and the repeating 12-second pulses. The seismic line continued, small but steady. He told Gary not to record it as equipment failure until the morning technical crew had inspected the system. Outside, the fog had grown thicker and was hiding the lower halves of the light poles. Shaft number 7 sat behind a row of containers and a mound of rock, so there was no direct view from the control room. Only the dull yellow glow from the gravel yard in that direction still showed through the fog like a patch of light with nobody inside it. At about 2:10, Jack was reviewing footage from the previous shift when the halogen lamp on pole number 3 began flickering. The light over the gravel yard dimmed, then came back hard, accompanied by a high electrical hum that carried through the system. Gary looked up. Jack looked at the mechanical clock. At 2:14, the western perimeter alarm light suddenly flashed red, and the warning bell sounded 3 times in a row. No worker was authorized to be in that area at that hour. Jack immediately pulled his chair in front of the closed-circuit television controls. Black Ridge's security system in 1988 had no flat screens or digital storage. In front of Jack stood a row of black and white cathode ray tube monitors with curved glass faces. Beneath them were mechanical channel switches and a U-matic tape recorder turning slowly. He switched to camera 4, a wide-angle view covering the gravel yard between the concrete plant and shaft number 7. The picture jumped slightly and was filled with white grain from interference. Camera 9, mounted closer to the shaft entrance, showed the yellow striped wooden barrier and part of the service road. Both images were empty for the first few seconds. Jack rewound the tape 1 minute and moved the control into slow playback. Dry tape hiss came through the monitor speaker. At 2:13 and 50 seconds, the gravel yard was empty. At 2:14 exactly, the halogen lamp flickered once. At 2:14 and 12 seconds, the image jumped sideways, as though an electrical pulse had passed through the signal line. At that exact moment, a large dark area appeared at the left edge of camera 4. Jack stopped the tape, adjusted the tracking, and played it again more slowly. Each time the dark form took another step, the cathode ray tube image gave a very small jump. It wasn't enough to lose the picture, but the pattern was regular enough that Jack realized the interference matched the movement of whatever was entering the yard. Gary pulled his chair so close that his knees touched the console. Jack switched to camera 9, then back to camera 4 to compare angles. An enormous dark figure walked through the edge of the thick yellow light from the halogen lamps. The head rose nearly to the bottom of a warning sign mounted on a wooden pole that Jack knew stood about 10 feet high. The shoulders were far wider than those of any man in a heavy coat. The body didn't hunch the way a bear would if standing upright. The Sasquatch remained straight and balanced on 2 legs. One arm hung low, nearly to the knee. The other dragged something heavy across the gravel behind him. Jack increased the optical zoom on camera 4. The larger the image became, the more grain broke across it, but the body proportions were still clear. The Bigfoot was covered in dense black hair, thickest across the shoulders, back and thighs. The head sat low between the shoulders with almost no visible neck. The arms were long, the hands large, and the stride was longer than anything Jack had ever seen from a person. He used the spacing between two marker posts in the yard to estimate it. Each step covered nearly 6 feet. Gary had stopped suggesting it might be a bear. Both men simply watched the Sasquatch move slowly into the light as though he knew exactly where he was going. At exactly 2:14 and 32 seconds, on the timestamp, camera 4 caught the Bigfoot's entire body. Jack estimated the Sasquatch stood close to 10 feet tall. In the right hand, he held the rear leg of a large North American gray wolf, dragging the body without even tightening the shoulders. The adult wolf had a long body, a heavy chest, and silver-gray fur. Its head struck the gravel with each step. There was no movement from the wolf itself. Jack studied the neck and muzzle, but didn't see blood leaving a trail. The Bigfoot didn't bend down to bite or sniff the body either. He simply pulled the wolf across the yard between silent machines, following an almost perfectly straight line toward shaft number 7. The cameras didn't record sound directly, but from outside the control room, Jack could faintly hear gravel scraping under heavy weight. Each time the Sasquatch's foot came down, camera 4 gave another small tremor. It immediately reminded Jack of the 12-second seismic pulses they had been recording since before midnight, even though the Bigfoot's steps now came much closer together. He kept that thought to himself. There was still nothing proving the two events were connected. At 2:16 seconds, the Sasquatch stopped directly in front of the yellow-striped wooden barrier at shaft number 7. He didn't drag the wolf beyond it. Instead, the Bigfoot bent down, kept hold of one rear leg with the right hand, and slid the left hand beneath the wolf's shoulder. In one slow movement, he lifted the body off the gravel, turned it sideways, and placed it directly across the entrance. The wolf's head pointed toward the shaft. Its body lay crosswise over the service road like a barricade. The Sasquatch lowered himself again, ran one hand along the wolf's side to smooth hair that had been pulled out of place, moved the front legs closer together, then finally stood upright. Jack felt his throat go dry. This didn't look like an animal carrying food back to a den. The Bigfoot wasn't eating the wolf, defending it, or hiding the body. Every movement had order to it, almost as though the Sasquatch was deliberately positioning the wolf exactly where he wanted it. He stood behind the body for 45 seconds. During that time, he barely moved and only stared into the darkness of shaft number 7. The halogen lamp on pole number 3 continued humming, its light strengthening and weakening enough to turn the black hair across the Sasquatch's shoulders from solid black to charcoal gray. At exactly 2:17 and 10 seconds, the Sasquatch turned his head, not toward the forest and not toward the workers' housing. He looked up at the wooden pole where camera 9 was mounted. Jack switched channels immediately and saw the face appear larger on the cathode ray tube monitor. Low forehead, heavy brow, broad nose, with darker skin around the eyes than the surrounding hair. When the halogen light struck the eyes, 2 bright white reflections flashed so strongly that they nearly hid the pupils. The Bigfoot looked directly into the lens for several seconds, long enough to make Jack feel that the Sasquatch knew someone was watching. Then the Bigfoot turned away and left. By 2:17 and 35 seconds, he was halfway across the yard. At 2:17 and 48, the body was only a black mass inside the fog. At exactly 2:18, the last part of the Sasquatch disappeared behind the western pine line. The camera continued recording the empty gravel yard, the yellow-striped barrier, and the wolf lying across the shaft entrance. Jack stopped the tape. The soft hiss of the U-matic recorder continued through the room like light rain. Gary sat perfectly still, with both hands on his knees. Jack didn't know what the first sentence should be. 10 minutes later, neither man had managed to say much of anything. Jack played the footage twice more, checking the timecode, tracking, and tape transport. There was no sign that the recording had been altered. He removed the U-matic cassette, wrote the sealing time on the label, and placed it inside a temporary locked cabinet. Before 3 in the morning, He used the duplication equipment in the communications room to copy the important 4-minute section onto a separate video home system cassette, something easier to carry into a conference room and play on ordinary equipment without removing the pneumatic deck from the security system. At 4:30 in the morning, Jack sat inside the management conference room with Elena Chen and Marcus Vance. Outside the window, dawn still hadn't arrived. Elena, the chief geological engineer, wore a sweater under her reflective work jacket, her hair tied back in a hurry. Marcus arrived last and was angry about being dragged out of bed before sunrise. Jack didn't give a long explanation. He placed the video home system cassette into the player, rolled the cathode ray tube television cart closer to the table, and started the footage at 2:14. Elena said nothing when the dark Sasquatch entered the light. The moment he placed the wolf across the barrier, she told Jack to stop the tape. Jack used the pause control, leaving the image trembling slightly on the screen. Elena opened the map tube she had brought with her, spread a hand-drawn geological section across the table, and used a ruler to point directly at shaft number 7. She measured the distance again from known markers, then looked up. The wolf had been placed almost exactly over the line of the drill shaft, where the morning crew was scheduled to activate a borehole nearly 500 feet deep at 8 o'clock. Marcus slammed one palm against the table. He said it was sabotage by local hunters, or someone trying to throw into a panic. Jack asked who could wear a costume, drag a full-grown wolf with one hand and take strides almost 6 feet long. Marcus didn't answer directly. He only ordered the original tape locked in the safe, forbidden any worker from seeing it, and said absolutely nothing about the incident was to leave the mine. Elena didn't argue about what the Sasquatch was. She only asked Jack about the seismic pulses from midnight and requested the ink paper recording. Jack laid the record across the table. Elena studied the pulses spaced 12 seconds apart and said the source could be more than 300 feet underground if all 3 sensors were reading correctly. She wanted drilling postponed until the subsurface structure could be checked. Marcus rejected that immediately, reminding them of the contract and the expansion schedule. By a little after 5:20, a gray strip of dawn had appeared above the ridge. Marcus still held to his order. At 8 o'clock, the drilling crew would prepare as planned unless Elena produced enough technical evidence to close the shaft. At exactly 5:30, the mine-wide alarm suddenly began screaming. The siren cut through the conference room walls as red warning lights came on in the hallway. Jack ran back toward the control room with Elena directly behind him. The seismic recorder was jerking so violently that the ink stylus bent to one side, leaving a thick black streak across the paper. No excavator, truck, or drill was running, but the concrete floor beneath their boots was visibly trembling. A powerful seismic pulse had just surged upward from the area, beneath shaft number 7, close to the surface. Jack looked through the window. Dawn was beginning to expose the gravel yard beneath the halogen lights. To the north, the dead wolf was still lying across the yellow-striped barrier at shaft number 7. Elena stood beside the seismic recorder with one hand gripping the edge of the table, feeling the last vibration fade through the structure. Nobody was talking about sabotage anymore. For the first time since watching the tape, Jack began to think that the most dangerous thing at Black Ridge might not be the nearly 10-foot Sasquatch that had walked out of the forest. Maybe he was simply the first one who knew exactly what was beneath their feet. At 5:42 in the morning, a little more than 10 minutes after the seismic alarm finally went quiet, Jack, Elena, and 2 security officers walked out onto the northern gravel yard. Fog still hung low around their knees, but there was enough daylight now to clearly see the yellow-striped wooden barrier at shaft number 7 and the dead wolf lying across the entrance exactly where the enormous Sasquatch had placed it at 2:16. Gary stayed in the control room to monitor the cameras and radio while Jack carried a steel measuring tape, a Polaroid camera, evidence bags, and a shotgun slung across his back. He didn't like carrying a firearm onto a scene when he still didn't know what he was dealing with. But after what they had watched on the cathode ray tube monitors, sending the group out unarmed bothered him even more. Nobody said much on the walk to the shaft. The crawler excavators sat motionless in the fog like dead blocks of steel, their tracks packed with mud and crushed stone. The smell of cold diesel fuel, leftover blasting residue from the afternoon shift, and wet earth mixed in the air. The closer Jack came to shaft number 7, the more he noticed another smell, strong and sharp like the musk of a large animal, clinging to the back of his throat. Elena stopped near the barrier, took a short breath, and said, there was also a trace of ozone, the damp metallic smell that sometimes followed an electrical discharge or came from certain rock fractures releasing mineral gases. Jack could smell it too, like the air before a thunderstorm, even though the bitterroot sky above them was nothing but cold, gray. The wolf was more intact than Jack expected. The belly hadn't been torn open, no soft tissue was missing, and there were no obvious tooth marks or signs of feeding. The silver-gray coat was dirty from being dragged across gravel, but the skin was barely damaged. Jack knelt, put on gloves, and examined the neck. The head sat at an unnatural angle, and when he ran 2 fingers along the vertebrae, he found a clear depression beneath the fur. One security officer held the wolf's front legs while Jack carefully lifted the skull. The neck had been broken cleanly, almost as if by one powerful twisting force rather than a bite or prolonged struggle. Jack had seen deer killed by cougars, wolves caught in traps, and prey animals with bones crushed by bears. But this injury didn't match the way predators in these mountains usually killed. Then he turned to the marks in the gravel. The crushed stone around shaft number 7 had been compacted by road rollers to support loaded haul trucks, so even work boots left only shallow impressions. Yet behind the wolf was a line of deep depressions leading toward the forest. Jack placed the steel tape beside the clearest one. It measured more than 18 inches long, with the front spreading into 5 distinct toes. The center of the track had sunk almost 2 inches into the hard-packed surface. Jack put his full weight onto a board beside it to test the ground, and the gravel compressed less than half an inch. The distance between one track and the next was nearly 6 feet, matching his estimate from the camera footage. Elena found several black hairs caught on the top of a fence post where the Bigfoot had bent down. The strands were long and coarse, thicker than human hair, and several showed a brown tone near the root when held in the light. She placed each one inside a paper envelope, wrote the date and time, then sealed it. Jack took Polaroid photographs of the with the measuring tape beside them. Looking along the line toward the forest, he saw the prints went almost straight into the pines without any running stride or sudden change of direction. The Sasquatch had approached and returned along nearly the same route, as though leaving tracks behind hadn't mattered. Jack looked back at the wolf. The body rested exactly on the center line leading into shaft number 7, its head pointed inward and its torso lying crosswise across the entrance. Even if he wasn't ready to call it a message, the placement was too deliberate to dismiss as chance. Elena checked the time and said she needed the complete seismic data before Marcus allowed the morning crew anywhere near the shaft. They left the security officers to add another perimeter line and keep workers away from the wolf, then returned to the technical buildings before 6:30. Elena's subsurface analysis room sat inside a prefabricated metal building, behind the main operations office, crowded with paper maps, seismic film rolls, a large workstation computer, and analog control equipment. Black Ridge didn't have real-time, 3-dimensional imaging in 1988. Most underground modeling relied on seismic reflection data, printed cross-sections, and rough graphics programs running on the workstation. Elena loaded the most recent survey tape, overlaid the readings from the sensors used the night before, and began rebuilding the section beneath shaft number 7. Jack stood behind her, and watched the reflected layers appear one by one. The upper structure was familiar: broken rock, hardened sediment, then thick limestone. But below, roughly 400 feet, the signal changed abruptly. Instead of continuous reflections, a broad, dark zone appeared like a section had been cut out of the model. Elena changed the scale, reran the noise filters, and compared the image with two older survey lines. The dark area remained. It extended beneath much of the eastern side of the shaft, with vertical branches dropping below the current depth of the survey. Elena said that if the data were correct, a massive underground cavity existed beneath the limestone, possibly part of a natural cave system formed along fracture zones. More troubling, the reflections along the roof of that cavity showed several areas that appeared unusually thin. She took the current drilling plan, laid it over the cross-section, and drew a red line downward. The drill head was now less than 16 feet from the weakest section of the roof. If the morning crew continued, the drill might break directly through the ceiling of the cavity instead of remaining inside solid rock. Jack asked what would happen if the roof broke. Elena pointed to the blank zones in the data and said the open chamber could contain naturally compressed gas, water, or trapped air under different pressure. If the drill opened even a small hole, gas could surge back through the bore pipe. If the roof lost structural stability, the weight of the drilling rig and the work yard above could cause sections of the ceiling to collapse. The earlier surveys had missed the cavity because the measurement lines hadn't crossed deeply enough at the right angle. Elena pulled a low filing cabinet away from the corner of the room. Black Ridge had seen limited mining activity as far back as the 1930s, when smaller companies drove tunnels into the mountainside and abandoned them without producing complete maps. Inside a decaying cardboard box were photocopies from county records, accident reports, employee lists, and old excavation diagrams. Near the bottom of the box, they found the name of a mining company that had gone out of business before the war. A report from November of 1937 stated that an exploratory drilling crew had broken into an unidentified cavity at a depth of roughly 360 to 425 feet, depending on the older reference system being used. After the incident, 6 miners failed to return from the underground shift. No bodies were ever recovered. The official report blamed a rock collapse and toxic gas, but an appendix said the rescue team had been forced to withdraw because of an unusual cold airflow and sounds coming from the damaged section of the mine. 2 weeks later, the company closed that excavation and moved its equipment elsewhere. Elena placed the 1937 map beside the modern one. The scales were different, but the old drilling point sat disturbingly close to the eastern section of shaft number 7. Jack asked whether Marcus had ever seen the file. Elena shook her head. The old material hadn't been included in the data package provided by the parent company when Black Ridge was reopened, or someone had dismissed it as irrelevant history. She circled the old drilling point and wrote 6 missing, then circled the current cavity roof and wrote 16 feet. The 2 red marks were close enough that neither of them needed to explain the problem. At 7:20, Elena carried the maps, seismic film, and the 1937 report into Marcus's office. Jack went with her. Marcus had changed into a clean shirt, and his desk held coffee, a telephone, and a stack of morning shift schedules. Through the window, workers were gathering around equipment, but nobody had been allowed into shaft number 7 because Jack's security perimeter was still in place. Elena didn't mention Bigfoot. She spread the seismic cross-section across the desk, pointed to the cavity, and said drilling had to stop until the roof stability could be properly evaluated. Marcus asked how certain the data was. Elena said it was certain enough that she wouldn't allow a drilling rig weighing tens of tons to push another 16 feet downward. He asked whether the dark area might simply be reflection noise. She told him she had rerun the analysis across 3 separate survey lines, and the same cavity appeared in all 3. Jack placed the 1937 report on the desk. Marcus read the section about the 6 missing miners, frowned, and asked why an accident from 50 years earlier should have the power to shut down a modern project. Elena told him the issue wasn't the old accident, it was the geology beneath them right now. If the cavity roof was weak, they needed to survey from the side, remove weight from the area, and conduct small-diameter test drilling. That could take several days. Marcus immediately brought up the investment contract, quarterly targets, and penalties if Black Ridge missed the final transportation window of the season. Tens of millions of dollars had already been committed to expanding the reserve. He couldn't call headquarters and say the mine was stopping because of oversized bear tracks, a dead wolf, and a report from half a century ago. Jack placed 2 Polaroids of the tracks on the desk and said bears didn't leave 5-toed prints like those while walking on 2 legs. Marcus glanced at them and pushed the photographs aside. He said he didn't care what the animal was, unless it had damaged equipment or hurt somebody. Jack said that was exactly what mattered. The Sasquatch had walked through a yard full of machinery without touching any of it. The only thing he had done was carry a dead wolf directly to shaft number 7. Elena added that afterward, they had recorded a major seismic pulse rising from that same area. Marcus said the connection was still speculation. He agreed to give Elena a few more hours to investigate, but he wouldn't cancel the drilling shift. The order remained to prepare the rig and be ready to start as soon as he gave approval. Marcus told Jack to double security around the shaft, issue shotguns to the outer posts, lock down the camera tapes, and stop employees from talking about what they had seen. The wolf had to be removed before the entire morning shift saw it. Jack agreed, once enough photographs and samples had been collected, but when he walked out of Marcus's office, he already knew secrecy had become impossible. 2 security officers in the locker room asked him directly whether the figure on camera 4 had been Bigfoot. Out in the yard, the local drilling crew had gathered beside a service truck, and none of them was moving toward shaft number 7. Nolan, the oldest man in the group, said they had heard knocking inside the ventilation pipe at about 6:50 that morning. 3 strikes in a row, almost half a minute of silence, then 3 more. 2 other workers confirmed it. One said that when he placed his hand close to the steel housing, he could feel each impact through the metal. Jack asked whether rock could have been falling inside the pipe. Nolan shook his head. Falling rock rolled and struck irregularly. This sounded like a hammer hitting from below. Jack ordered everyone to stay away from the ventilation line until Elena could inspect it. Nolan said his crew wouldn't go down into shaft number 7, even if Marcus signed the order himself. He had spent 18 years underground and knew the difference between moving rock and something striking metal from deep below. By close to 9 in the morning, the mine had settled into a strange half-working state. Marcus still hadn't authorized the drill because Elena's written warning remained in effect, but he ordered equipment crews to clear the yard, move supplies, and reopen the northern haul route. A crawler tractor was sent toward the single road running between the ore yard and the base of the mountain, about 650 feet from shaft number 7. Jack was standing near the way station when he heard a heavy impact from the slope above, followed by snapping pine branches. Everyone looked up. A boulder about the size of a small truck bed rolled off the edge of the slope, struck the road, bounced once, and came to rest directly across it. The tractor operator stopped immediately. A few seconds later, a second boulder came down, then a third. They didn't fall as part of one continuous landslide. Each came separately, with a pause between them, almost as if they were being pushed one at a time from a rock ledge above. Jack shouted for everyone to move back from the base of the slope. The final 4 boulders piled up across the middle of the road, completely blocking haul truck access to shaft number 7. Then the mountainside went still. No more soil moved, and no large cloud of dust followed. Elena came running from the geology building. Jack took binoculars from the patrol vehicle and studied the top of the slope. Between two groups of pines stood two black figures against the brighter sky. Both were far taller than a person. The Sasquatch on the left was larger, broad-shouldered, with long black hair covering the arms and body, and the proportions matched the Bigfoot recorded on camera 4. The second stood slightly behind, somewhat shorter, but still much larger than any bear standing upright. Neither Sasquatch threw another rock. They simply stood there, looking down at the mine. Jack lowered the binoculars, but kept watching the slope. What unsettled him most was the distance the two Bigfoots maintained. They were close enough to watch the tractor and the workers below, but they made no attempt to chase anyone. The boulders had blocked the road, not struck the office buildings, trucks, or workers. If their purpose had been to attack, they had been given far better opportunities during the night. Jack could no longer ignore the pattern taking shape. The wolf at the shaft entrance, the rocks across the road, every action stopping exactly at a boundary leading toward number 7. Jack handed the binoculars to Elena. She watched for a long time, lowered them, then raised them again to make sure the light wasn't fooling her. Marcus came out of the office with 2 guards, angrily demanding to know who had stopped the tractor. Jack gave him the binoculars. Marcus looked for less than 10 seconds. When he lowered them, the anger was still there, but much of the color had left his face. The 2 Bigfoots didn't roar, approach the workers, or damage any equipment. One rested a hand on a boulder beside the feet, looked down at the blocked road, then turned toward the forest. The other remained in place for several more seconds, with the face directed toward shaft number 7. Then both Sasquatches backed into the pine line and disappeared. Marcus ordered the tractor to clear the road, but nobody moved immediately. Jack looked at the blocked route, then back toward the wolf, now covered by a tarp beside the shaft barrier. One warning had been placed directly across the entrance during the night. Now, in full daylight, a second route toward the shaft had been blocked without a single person being attacked. Jack still didn't know what those Sasquatches understood about the underground cavity or the knocking beneath the mine. But for the second time, in less than 7 hours, everything they had done led to the same result. They were trying to keep people from going any deeper into shaft number 7. At 10:40 that morning, Marcus Vance signed the order to continue work at shaft number 7 on the hood of a service truck, despite the geological warning Elena had just placed in front of him. The boulders blocking the northern road had already been pushed aside by the crawler tractor, but the workers still stood in small groups, and none of them looked eager to return to the drilling area. Marcus called over the operations supervisor and ordered a small explosive charge to break the remaining hard rock in front of the drill head, then told the crew to restart the rotary rig according to schedule. Elena warned him one last time that the cavity below wasn't on any map, that only a few feet of load-bearing rock might remain in the roof, and that any additional vibration was unnecessary. Marcus looked at her and said that if Black Ridge shut down every time the data wasn't perfect, the mine would have closed months ago. Jack stood several steps away with the radio in his hand and said nothing. He watched the drilling crew prepare the lines, check the electric detonators, and clear everyone beyond the safety perimeter. Several local miners refused to go anywhere near the shaft entrance, so Marcus replaced them with the day shift equipment crew. At exactly 11:06, the blasting siren gave 3 warnings. Jack moved Elena behind the concrete barrier. A dry explosion struck the mountainside, smaller than a normal production blast, but strong enough to send rock dust rolling out of shaft number 7. 2 seconds later, a deeper, slower vibration rose through the ground beneath Jack's boots. Elena turned toward him. They had both felt it. The drilling crew waited for the dust to settle, then powered the main motor. The heavy rotary rig came alive. The gearbox began grinding, and the drill shaft turned slowly under load. The mechanical depth gauge crept forward. 397 feet. 400, 403. Jack could hear steel cutting through rock even through his ear protection. Elena stood close to the controls, never taking her eyes off the torque needle. When the drill reached close to 410 feet, the sound suddenly changed into a metallic scream so high that several workers covered their ears. The torque needle jumped, snapped violently, then dropped almost to zero. The drill shaft plunged downward. Nobody reacted during the first second. More than 30 feet of steel slid freely through the guide collar, as though something below had pulled it out of their hands. The operator hit the brake, but the shaft kept dropping until the mechanical clamp finally caught. The entire drill rig lurched forward, its steel frame shaking hard enough to look as though it might tear loose from its foundation. A deep pop came up through the rock, then freezing air blasted backward through the drill pipe, with enough force to throw dust and small fragments of stone out of the shaft entrance. The smell arrived almost immediately. It wasn't blasting residue or the familiar bite of sulfur. It was stronger, like rotting meat soaked in metallic water, mixed with old damp earth, mold, and a sharp sour odor that made Jack cover his nose. Cold vapor spread close to the ground in low white ribbons. Elena shouted for the crew to shut everything down and move upwind. One driller didn't make it far before doubling over and vomiting beside the crawler tracks. Jack grabbed him and pulled him away from the shaft, while keeping his eyes on the concrete beneath his boots. A thin crack appeared less than 6 feet from the base of the drilling rig. It wandered across the concrete, then split into 3 branches as it reached the gravel yard. Another fracture opened near the yellow barrier where the wolf had been lying earlier. Within seconds, the cracks connected into a spiderweb pattern beneath the generator, fence posts, and truck route. Each time a deep knock sounded from below, another section widened by a fraction of an inch. Jack shouted over the radio for an immediate evacuation of Sector 7. This time nobody argued. The toxic sensors inside the control building started screaming before all the workers had cleared the yard. Red warning lights came on one after another across the panel. Hydrogen sulfide rising, carbon dioxide rising, oxygen falling in low areas. Another detector fluctuated wildly, as though it were reacting to a compound the instrument had never been calibrated to identify. Elena grabbed filter masks from the emergency cabinet, handed one to Jack, and ran toward the main power disconnect. Marcus stood outside the dust zone, asking repeatedly why the motor was still turning. The emergency stop had already been pushed, but the drill shaft didn't come to a complete stop. Something deep below seemed to have caught the bit against a rock edge or another structure inside the cavity, sending torque back through the system in violent cycles. The main motor slowed, but the gearbox kept grinding. Elena pulled the mechanical disconnect with both hands, putting her full weight into the lever. A blue spark jumped inside the contact box, then the main power died. The motor faded into silence, but heavy impacts continued traveling upward through the drill pipe as though something below were striking the steel. Jack helped drag 2 disoriented workers toward the temporary medical shelter. One said his eyes burned as if they had been exposed to acid smoke. Another was shaking from cold, even under a heavy jacket. Steel handrails near the shaft were coated with dark moisture. Jack wiped one with a gloved hand and saw that metal that had looked clean only hours earlier was already developing orange spots like fresh rust. Condensation collecting on the rail was corrosive enough that paint around an old scratch had begun to blister. Elena saw it and immediately ordered everyone to avoid contact with the moisture and move to higher ground. Marcus came closer, but Jack stopped him. "You wanted to know why we told you to shut it down? This is why." Marcus started to answer, but a piercing scream came up through the drill pipe. It didn't sound like metal. The noise stretched out, rose higher, then cut off suddenly. Everyone still nearby turned toward the shaft. A few seconds later, another sound answered from much deeper below, lower and out of rhythm with the first. Elena looked at Jack through her mask. Neither of them needed to say what they were both thinking. Something was down inside that cavity, or at the very least, something was moving in a way that didn't sound like collapsing rock. An older miner backed away from the shaft, muttering that gas didn't make sounds like that. Jack was about to ask what he meant when the ground shook hard. A section of concrete beside the drilling rig dropped almost an inch. The crack beneath the generator opened wide enough to reveal darkness below. Cold vapor burst from it in a white stream carrying an even stronger smell of decay. The nearest sensor immediately climbed to its highest alarm. At the edge of the yard, a ventilation pipe began shaking on its supports, even though it wasn't connected to any operating machine. 3 sharp impacts came from inside the pipe, spaced apart, followed by a long scraping sound that made Gary back away from the camera controls. Jack remembered what Nolan and the drilling crew had said that morning and looked at Elena. She only shook her head, watching the cracks widen. Nobody was treating those underground sounds as ordinary falling rock anymore. Elena ran to the field map table, spread the seismic cross-section over the lid of an equipment crate, and pointed at the cavity roof. "It's breached," she said. The drill head was no longer inside solid rock. It had punched through the roof of the chamber, and every movement of the shaft was breaking more stone away from the edges of the opening. If the roof continued to fracture, the entire workyard above it could lose support. Jack followed the crack running across the site with his eyes, then looked toward the northern forest. At that exact moment, Gary's voice came over the radio from the security station. "Close to breaking. Jack, camera 4 has movement." "More than one." Jack turned toward the tree line. The first Sasquatch stepped out of the pines in full daylight. Jack recognized him immediately. Nearly 10 feet tall, with thick black hair across the shoulders and arms, and the head sitting low between massive blocks of muscle. It was the same Bigfoot that had dragged the wolf across the yard during the night. But this time he wasn't alone. 3 more Sasquatches followed, one almost the same height, and 2 smaller individuals who were still larger than any person at Black Ridge. They didn't hide from the daylight, or stop at the edge of the trees the way they had earlier. All 4 walked directly into a gravel yard filled with alarms, workers, and white gas. One security officer raised his shotgun. Jack knocked the barrel down before the man could aim. "Don't shoot." The lead Bigfoot didn't even look at the workers. He walked to a large boulder beside the haul route, bent down, wrapped both hands around a stone. Jack guessed weighed several hundred pounds, and lifted one side. Muscles rose beneath the hair across the back and shoulders. The Sasquatch rolled the boulder over and began pushing it toward a crack near shaft number 7. The other 3 immediately started doing the same. Elena stood motionless. The second large Sasquatch dragged another boulder from the base of the slope using both hands, then drove it with one shoulder into a fracture, venting white gas. The 2 smaller Bigfoots carried lighter stones and packed them into the secondary cracks. They weren't moving randomly. Each Sasquatch chose a fracture, pushed rock toward it, forced smaller pieces into the gaps with their hands, then moved to the next opening. When a stronger stream of white gas burst from the eastern edge, the lead Bigfoot immediately changed direction and rolled a boulder directly onto it. Jack watched them work, then looked toward the dead wolf beneath the tarp beside the barrier. During the night, the Sasquatch had laid that wolf directly across the entrance. That morning, the Bigfoots had blocked the road with boulders. Now that people had broken through the cavity roof, the entire group had rushed into the mine site to seal the fractures themselves. The meaning of everything he had seen began changing in front of him. The wolf hadn't been a threat saying, "We can kill you." It had been a marker, a dead animal placed across a boundary. Don't go past this point. Elena seemed to reach the same conclusion. Very quietly, she said that maybe the Sasquatches had known for a long time that the area was dangerous, not through maps or geology, but through generations of survival. Gas leaking from underground could kill animals before people ever realized it was there. Whether the wolf had died after wandering too close to an old vent, or whether the Bigfoot had killed it and used the body as a warning, both possibilities led to the same point. The Sasquatches understood that the boundary was dangerous. Another shriek rose from the hole. All four Bigfoots stopped at once, their heads turned toward the darkness like animals hearing a predator close by. The lead Sasquatch gave a deep roar, not toward the workers, but downward into the ground. From far below, a sharper, longer shriek answered. Jack felt the hair rise along the back of his neck. Nobody saw what was beneath them. There was only sound, freezing gas, and the smell of decay rising in waves. But the way the Bigfoot group reacted made one thing difficult to ignore. This wasn't the first time they had heard those sounds. Marcus stood nearly 150 feet away from the yard, his face drained of color. He was no longer telling security to shoot or calling the Sasquatch's men in costumes. But he still didn't understand how quickly the collapse was progressing. Elena turned and shouted that everyone and every machine had to leave the sector immediately. Marcus looked at the multi-million-dollar drill rig, leaning slightly over fractured ground, and ordered 2 crawler tractors forward to tow it onto stable terrain. That was the last order that broke everything open. The first tractor moved toward the rig, its steel tracks pressing down on ground that had already lost support underneath. The surface trembled like a hollow floor. Jack heard a long cracking sound spread beneath them, deeper and wider than anything before. Elena spun toward Marcus. "Stop the tractor!" Too late. A major fracture tore across the yard from east to west. The concrete beneath the drilling rig dropped nearly 1.5 feet. The steel framework tilted hard, anchor, cables stretching until one snapped loose from its base. Workers ran. The tractor reversed sharply, its tracks slipping over crushed stone. Jack grabbed Elena and pulled her away from a crack that opened directly in front of her boots. The Bigfoots scattered too, but instead of retreating toward the forest, they moved back toward the large rocks around the edge of the yard. Then the ground beneath the drilling rig disappeared. There was no explosion. Only one impossibly deep collapse, like the lid of a box. After its support had been pulled away, and support had been pulled away. The drill rig tilted, slid off its foundation, and fell first. Dozens of feet of steel vanished into darkness, dragging the drill pipe, electrical cables, and part of the scaffolding with it. The generator beside it tipped over and followed, striking the wall of the opening with a long, twisting scream of metal. The sinkhole widened with terrifying speed, in huge slabs, and slid into the cavity below, and slid into the cavity below. Rock dust erupted upward in a column, mixing with white gas until the entire area disappeared behind a thick gray cloud. Jack saw the opening reach at least 100 feet across before visibility vanished. There was no bottom he could see, only darkness, and the echoing sounds of structures continuing to collapse somewhere underneath. Marcus turned and ran. His hard hat fell off and he left it behind, sprinting toward the office buildings, without looking back. Jack couldn't blame him for running, but Elena was still beside him on a narrow strip of ground between 2 fractures that was separating from the main yard. Jack grabbed her wrist. "Move!" They ran south. The first 2 steps held. On the third, the ground to their right dropped. Elena lost her balance and went down on one knee. Jack pulled her up, but a steel brace from the secondary scaffolding crashed in front of them and blocked the route. They turned left. The crack there widened to almost 3 feet, disappearing into darkness below. Jack and Elena were trapped on a strip of rock only several yards wide. The dust was so thick Jack could barely see the forest. Somewhere across the hole he heard a Bigfoot roar. Workers were shouting one another's names. Pieces of metal fell for what seemed like forever before striking something far below. Elena looked down at the edge beside her boots. Small stones were continuously sliding into the opening. The strip beneath them had begun to tilt. A terrible shriek rose from deep inside the sinkhole, closer than any of the earlier sounds. Immediately afterward, the ground behind Jack split open. He shoved Elena toward the center of the strip, but the entire section was separating from the rest of the yard. In front of them was a deep fracture. Behind them, the sinkhole was expanding. Freezing air surged upward from below, carrying rot, and the sounds of movement neither of them could see. Jack searched desperately for anything they could grab onto. There was nowhere left to run, and the strip of rock beneath their feet started dropping into the darkness. Rock dust swallowed the narrow strip of ground where Jack and Elena were trapped, turning everything into a thick gray haze. Cold air surged up from the edge of the sinkhole in waves, carrying the smell of wet metal, rotting earth, and a foul gas strong enough to sting their eyes. Jack crouched low, trying to stay balanced as the ground beneath them tilted farther toward the darkness. Elena had taken barely half a step when metal screamed behind them. A section of the drilling framework, already missing part of its support, came down like a steel arm. Jack managed to yank her shoulder aside. The main beam missed her body, but struck her right leg and pinned her against the ground. She cried out, then clenched her jaw. Through the dust, Jack saw the steel beam, more than 20 feet long, lying diagonally across her lower leg, one end still caught in the scaffolding joint, while the other hung close to the edge of the sinkhole. Small stones kept slipping away from the strip beneath them. Every time another chunk of rock broke loose from the wall of the sinkhole, the ground shook like a hollow floor. Jack grabbed a short pry bar from a nearby tool rack, worked the steel end beneath the beam, and used a broken piece of concrete as a fulcrum. He threw his full weight onto the handle. The beam moved less than half an inch. Elena tried to pull her leg free and stopped immediately from the pain. Jack changed the angle and pried again, shoulders locked, hands sliding through dust. The steel gave only a long, scraping groan. He told her not to yank the leg until they knew whether the bone was broken, then glanced toward the ground behind them. A new crack had opened, already several inches wide, and lengthening along the narrow strip. On his third attempt, the piece of concrete under the pry bar shattered. The bar kicked upward and nearly caught Jack under the chin. A deep roar rolled through the dust and made both of them look up. An enormous black shape was coming toward them from the far side of the fracture, stepping across broken slabs of concrete on wide, steady feet. As the Sasquatch came closer, Jack recognized the lead Bigfoot that had dragged the wolf across the yard during the night and had been rolling boulders into the gas vents only minutes earlier. Gray dust coated the black hair across the shoulders in patches, and one arm had a long cut where sharp rock had torn through the fur. The Bigfoot didn't stop when he saw the pry bar in Jack's hands. One massive hand reached through the dust and closed around the middle of the fallen beam. The Sasquatch crouched low, spread his feet for balance, and pulled. The beam slid free from the joint behind it but still didn't lift. The Bigfoot changed grip, got both hands underneath, and heaved upward. The steel came off the ground, the middle of the beam bending slightly where it had twisted during the collapse. Jack got one arm beneath Elena's shoulders and pulled the instant there was enough space. She gritted her teeth, pushed with the uninjured leg, and slid clear. The Bigfoot turned the entire beam aside and threw it away from the narrow strip. It struck the edge of the sinkhole and disappeared, the sound of steel hitting rock continuing for several moments before fading below. Elena tried to stand, but the right leg wouldn't take weight. Jack wrapped one arm around her waist and braced her against his shoulder. They had taken only 2 steps when the ground behind them dropped. The lead Bigfoot turned and gave one short roar. From the dust on the left, a second Sasquatch appeared, somewhat smaller but still more than 8 feet tall, moving so fast Jack didn't have time to get out of the way. One large hand grabbed the back of Jack's work jacket near the collar. The other caught the reflective strap on Elena's vest. Jack felt himself lifted off the ground like a duffel bag. In one motion, the Sasquatch hauled both of them away from the strip as it broke apart. The Bigfoot turned at the hips and pushed them toward the outer rock shelf beyond the collapse zone. using just enough controlled force to send them across a gap nearly 6 feet wide. Jack landed on one shoulder, rolled once, and hit his back against a pile of gravel. Elena came down on her good side, protecting the injured leg. A second later, the strip where they had been standing disappeared completely, taking another section of concrete into the sinkhole. Jack turned immediately to find the lad, Bigfoot. The Sasquatch was still near the collapsing edge when a broken slab of concrete from the drilling foundation fell sideways and struck the upper shoulder. The Bigfoot dropped to one knee. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting wet timber. Jack thought the Sasquatch would be carried down with the debris, but the Bigfoot planted one hand against the ground, roared, and forced himself back upright, the left shoulder hanging noticeably lower. A stronger blast of cold air surged from the sinkhole and whipped the dust into a twisting column. Mixed with the sound of falling rock were other noises now, short growls, claws scraping across stone, and overlapping shrieks rising and falling from somewhere deep inside the cavity. The darkness beneath them sounded as though more than one source was moving at once. Elena lay on her side with one hand wrapped around her lower leg, staring at the widening hole. She said that if the cavity roof kept losing support, the entire sector could go with it. Jack looked around. The north yard had become a maze of cracks, overturned machinery, and white gas. Farther away, a large mine haul truck was still parked beside the control station, its bed loaded with gravel from the previous shift. Nearby sat a bulldozer and two piles of heavy riprap used to reinforce roads. Jack understood they couldn't simply run and leave the collapse alone. If the opening kept expanding, toxic gas would spill down into the valley, and the remaining ground might fail with it. He helped Elena behind an intact concrete block and quickly checked her leg. No bone had broken through the skin, but the ankle and lower leg were swelling fast. Jack made a temporary splint from a piece of wood and emergency bandage. When he pointed toward the haul truck, Elena looked at the amount of stone in the bed and said, 50 tons. Jack gave a short answer. Even better. He limped across the yard, jumped 2 fractures, and passed a generator burning weakly from one side. The truck still had its key in the ignition because the driver had abandoned it when the sinkhole opened. Jack climbed into the cab and flipped the main power switch. The huge diesel engine turned over heavily twice, then caught, its deep roar overpowering the scattered alarms still sounding across the mine. Jack backed the truck slowly toward the sinkhole, watching the mirrors and the unstable ground behind him. There was no spotter, no hand signal, only dust and the opening widening in the earth. He lowered the window and heard Elena shouting directions from a distance. The left rear tire rolled across a cracked section, and the entire cab leaned sharply. Jack corrected the steering, brought the rear of the truck close to the widest part of the opening, and stopped. Outside, the Bigfoot group had returned. All 4 Sasquatches appeared through the dust, instead of retreating toward the forest. The lead Bigfoot still carried the left shoulder low, but used the other arm to push a massive piece of riprap toward an eastern fracture. The 2 smaller Sasquatches worked together, rolling stones toward cracks where white gas was escaping. The second large Bigfoot, heavier through the chest and body, stood near the truck and watched Jack through the cab window. Jack released the dump bed lock and engaged the hydraulic lift. The pump screamed under pressure, and the bed began rising slowly. 50 tons of gravel shifted backward as one moving mass, shaking the truck suspension. When the angle became steep enough, the first stones broke loose and poured over the edge like a gray waterfall. The impact from below rolled back through the opening. White vapor burst upward, then sank lower as the weight of the rock pushed down over the cavity. Jack kept raising the bed and let the gravel flow continuously into the sinkhole. The Bigfoots moved aside, then immediately began pushing heavy stones into sections the truck couldn't cover. The lead Sasquatch chose the largest boulders, using his back and shoulder to force them across the ground. One of the smaller Bigfoots grabbed medium-sized rocks and threw them into secondary cracks. Jack never gave them a signal, but every one of them was doing the same job. A deep crack sounded beneath the truck. Jack checked the left mirror and saw the ground behind the rear tires beginning to drop. The whole truck slid backward several inches. He hit the brakes, but the gravel beneath the tires was being pulled toward the sinkhole. The dump bed was still high, shifting the center of gravity toward the rear and making the danger of a rollover worse by the second. Jack pulled the control to lower the bed, but the hydraulics responded slowly under load. The truck slid again. Elena shouted from somewhere ahead, but he couldn't make out the words. Jack looked at the cab door and considered jumping. Stable ground was nearly 6 feet away, but if the truck moved suddenly, he could go down with it. The moment the right rear tire reached the edge of the fracture, a dark shape rushed in. The heavier Bigfoot moved behind the truck, crouched low, and planted both hands against the outside of the rear tire and the steel fender frame. Jack saw the Sasquatch's feet dig into the gravel, knees bent, shoulders pressed into the truck. The vehicle kept sliding, but the movement slowed noticeably. The Bigfoot roared, the entire body tightening beneath the hair. Another Sasquatch ran over and shoved a large rock in front of the wheel. Jack understood. He only had a few seconds. He pulled the parking brake, killed the engine, opened the door, and jumped onto the gravel, rolling away from the truck. Behind him, the Bigfoot released the wheel, just as the edge dropped farther. The truck slid backward almost 2 feet, then stopped when the rear tire caught against the wedged boulder. Most of the load had already emptied from the bed, so the center of gravity shifted forward again. Jack got to his knees and looked at the Sasquatch that had held the truck. The Bigfoot stood upright, breathing hard, both hands covered in black dust. In the gray light, the chest and hips looked different from the lead males, the shoulders slightly narrower and the body softer through the waist. Jack couldn't be certain, but this may have been an adult female. He barely had time to consider it before another crack opened at the edge of the yard. The female Bigfoot turned and ran toward it. Jack went back to Elena. She had managed to stand on one leg, leaning against the concrete block, while watching the entire scene unfold between the workers and the Sasquatches. When Jack reached her, she pointed toward a bulldozer that was still operable on the southern side. "Push that rock pile in from there. If we fill it from both sides, the weight will spread more evenly." 2 workers had returned to the edge of the site as the gas levels began to drop. But Jack wouldn't let them come deeper into the collapse zone. He called the bulldozer operator over the radio and told him to get back into the cab, while Jack moved along Elena's directions to mark the sections of ground that still looked solid. The bulldozer lowered its blade and began pushing a mound of gravel and packed earth toward the sinkhole. Across from them, the Bigfoot group moved parallel to the machine, rolling heavy stones into the wider cracks. The first mass pushed by the bulldozer spilled over the edge. The hole swallowed it for several seconds. Then the lower section began filling. The white gas weakened. The shrieks from inside the cavity sounded farther away, muffled by stone, dirt, and broken concrete. The lead Sasquatch stood on a section of stable ground and pushed a massive boulder with both hands toward the exact point where the drill had broken through. The injured shoulder trembled under the effort, but the Bigfoot didn't back away. 2 other Sasquatches came over and helped roll the boulder into place. When it dropped into the fracture, one final hard blast of gas erupted, carrying a long shriek like metal being torn apart. Then the sound stopped abruptly. The quiet arrived so quickly that Jack thought his hearing had gone out. The bulldozer throttled down. Gas alarms farther away were still sounding, but nothing was venting around shaft number 7 anymore. Thick rock dust drifted across the yard and broke into thinner sheets under the cold wind. The sinkhole hadn't disappeared, but the deepest section had packed with gravel, broken concrete, and large boulders. The widest fractures around the edge had also been filled. Elena had one worker help her farther away, then turned to look back at the site. She said the ground would need hours, maybe days, to stabilize, but at least the pressure was dropping. Jack checked the handheld gas meter. Hydrogen sulfide was still elevated but falling, and oxygen levels were beginning to recover in the areas exposed to moving air. The Bigfoots didn't remain in the middle of the work site. The two smaller Sasquatches backed toward the pine line first. The female followed, stopping once to look at the haul truck still caught near the edge before turning toward Jack. The lead Bigfoot was the last to leave. He moved more slowly, now, the left shoulder still hanging low from the concrete impact, and a dark line of blood running into the hair across the chest. At the edge of the gravel yard, the Sasquatch stopped. Only about 100 feet separated Jack from him. During the night, Jack had watched those eyes reflect as two bright spots on a monitor. In daylight, they looked dark, deep, and calm. The Bigfoot looked at Jack, then toward Elena, as another worker helped her stand farther back. There was no roar and no threat, only a long enough pause for Jack to understand that every action since the night before had pointed toward the same purpose: keep whatever was beneath shaft number 7 down there. The lead Sasquatch turned, walked into the forest, and disappeared. The other three vanished behind the pines with him, so quickly that within seconds there was no black hair and barely a branch moving. The wind shifted and cleared some of the dust from the yard. Black Ridge looked as though artillery had struck it. The drilling rig was gone. Machinery lay overturned. Concrete roads were split apart. The haul truck sat trapped beside the hole, and stone was scattered everywhere. But beneath the newly packed material, the shrieks had stopped, and the smell of rot was beginning to fade. Jack sat beside Elena and looked at the splint wrapped around her leg. Neither of them talked about Bigfoot yet. They were too exhausted, too dirty, and still too far from understanding what they had just witnessed. Neither of them believed anymore that Black Ridge had suffered only an ordinary mining accident. Far below the mountain pass, another sound began rising toward them, faint at first like wind, then growing clearer with every minute. Emergency sirens. Marcus must have called for outside help after running from the sector. Rescue teams from town were now climbing toward Black Ridge, and within minutes dozens of people would see what remained. Jack looked toward the forest one last time, but there were no dark figures left to see. In front of him were only wreckage, blood on the rocks, and one practical question neither Jack nor Elena was ready to answer. When outsiders reached Black Ridge, what were they going to say about what had really happened there? The first rescue team reached Black Ridge while rock dust still hung over the northern yard. The ambulance stopped outside the collapse perimeter. Firefighters stretched safety lines around shaft number 7, and a technical crew wearing filter masks moved carefully into the area where gas still lingered. Jack sat on the step of the medical truck while a medic cleaned the scratches on his arms. But his eyes stayed on the pine line where the 4 Bigfoots had disappeared. Elena lay on a stretcher nearby, with her right leg secured in a rigid splint, asking whether anyone had recovered the seismic paper roll. Marcus stood some distance away, his jacket coated in white dust, both hands wrapped around a cup of hot coffee even though they were still shaking. The man who had pushed every warning aside could no longer look toward shaft number 7 for more than a few seconds at a time. By afternoon, workplace safety officials and a geotechnical engineer brought in from outside the county had sealed off the northern sector. They measured the fractures, collected gas samples, recorded where the drill rig had disappeared, and reviewed the blasting schedule. What remained on the surface was enough to support a believable technical explanation: an undetected underground cavity, compressed gas pockets, vibration from blasting, and the weight of heavy equipment placed directly over ground that had already lost structural support. Elena also had a written warning issued before Marcus allowed drilling to continue, so the management failure was hard to ignore. But what didn't appear on any official form was sitting inside the security office. Tapes showing a nearly 10-foot Sasquatch dragging a wolf, a group of Bigfoots rolling stones into gas vents, and the moment they pulled Jack and Elena away from collapsing ground. When the investigators left the operations building to prepare their notes, Jack pushed Elena back into the surveillance room in a wheeled chair. The row of cathode ray tube monitors gave off a dull blue-gray glow. Camera 4 had shifted from its original angle after the collapse, but the U-matic cassette from the night before was still locked in the cabinet. The video home system copy Jack had made before dawn was there too, along with 2 tapes from the day shift. One showed the lead Bigfoot appearing through the dust. Another clearly showed the 3 Sasquatches behind him rolling rocks toward the sinkhole. In one short section, the second Bigfoot bent down and pulled Jack and Elena away from the ground breaking beneath them. The picture shook and disappeared behind dust in places, but it was clear enough to rule out bears, tree shadows, or people wearing costumes. Elena looked at the tapes and said that if they handed them over to the investigators, nobody would ever doubt that she had tried to stop the drilling. Jack could also prove that his security report hadn't been invented after the accident. Marcus had been standing in the yard when everything happened, and the footage could become important evidence if the company tried to shift responsibility onto the technical team. Jack understood all of that, but he could also see what came next. Once the tapes left Black Ridge, copies would be made. Then came the press, research groups, hunters, Bigfoot trackers, dogs, and people pouring into the Bitterroot Range just to find one good footprint. The Sasquatches that had just saved them would become targets of everything people liked to call by harmless-sounding words like verification, survey work, and research. Marcus walked into the room without knocking. He looked at the paused image of the lead Bigfoot pushing a boulder into a gas fracture, then pulled out a chair and sat down. Jack expected an order, but Marcus only said Black Ridge had to be shut down completely. Elena asked him to repeat it because she wasn't sure she had heard correctly. Marcus nodded and said he didn't want another drill, excavator, or survey crew anywhere near shaft number 7. He had watched 4 Sasquatches run into toxic gas instead of away from it, seen one lift a steel beam several people couldn't move, and heard those shrieks rising from below immediately after the cavity roof was breached. For the first time since Jack had known him, Marcus didn't mention production targets, contracts, or investment money. He only looked at the tapes on the table and said that if outsiders saw the footage, they would come back. Nobody in the room needed to ask who he meant. The next morning, the official investigation focused on geology. Elena presented the seismic reflection data, the 1937 report about 6 missing miners, the toxic gas readings, and the seismic record from before the collapse. When the safety representative asked why drilling had continued after the underground cavity was identified, Marcus accepted responsibility for allowing operations to proceed before the evaluation was finished. The room went quiet. Jack had never seen Marcus admit a mistake so quickly. Marcus said nothing about Bigfoot, and Elena added nothing beyond what the instruments could measure. A preliminary conclusion slowly took shape. Black Ridge had suffered a serious geotechnical failure, dangerous enough that the mine should remain closed until a new assessment could be completed. That evening, Jack returned to the security archive with Gary. In 1988, there was no central hard drive where someone could press a button and erase everything. The evidence existed on magnetic tape, time logs, Polaroid photographs, and a few duplicates. Jack pulled the original tapes from camera 4 and camera 9, the video home system copy, and the 2 morning shift tapes from the shelf. Gary watched for a while, then asked whether Jack was sure. Jack said that if they kept the material, sooner or later somebody would find it. Gary had been sitting beside him the night the Sasquatch dragged the wolf into the yard, so no more explanation was needed. He closed the door, pulled the blinds, and helped Jack remove the identifying labels from each cassette. Jack cut out the sections of magnetic tape containing the most important footage, then ran the remaining material through the technical room's degausser several times until the cathode ray tube monitor showed nothing but white snow and horizontal interference. The video home system copies were pulled from their housings, wound together and fed into the document incinerator along with the timesheets and the clearest Polaroids. Elena arrived later, carrying the paper envelope that held the black hairs she had collected from the fence post at shaft number 7. She opened it, studied the strands under the light for several seconds, then dropped the entire envelope into the fire. Nobody said anything as the paper edges curled, darkened, and disappeared. Jack kept only a short security report covering the sensors, ground vibration, and fence alarms. Under the camera 4 entry, he wrote, "Unidentified large animal entered northern yard," leaving out the estimated height, upright posture, and the fact that the Sasquatch had dragged the wolf. Gary signed a statement confirming that several camera channels had been damaged by electrical interference and ground shock during the collapse, which was true for part of the system. Elena returned to the geology office and rewrote her final report, using only what could be measured. Her conclusion stated, cause determined to be an underground natural gas pocket, resulting in localized mechanical subsidence. Geological conditions are completely unsuitable for any future mining activity. Permanent closure recommended on occupational safety grounds. An appendix added that the unmapped cave system extended beyond the project's survey limits, and that any new drilling could reactivate ground collapse or release toxic gas. Not one part mentioned Bigfoot, but Jack and Elena both understood that they had just done something completely against their professional instincts. Jack was paid to preserve evidence. Elena had built her career around data, traceable sources, and repeatable measurements. Now they had personally destroyed the clearest evidence either of them had ever seen. They didn't do it because they were afraid people would laugh. They did it because they had already seen what happened when human beings decided a place had to be opened at any cost. If those tapes became public evidence, Black Ridge might close as a mine only to reopen in another form, with hundreds of people arriving to hunt for the Sasquatches in the forest. Protecting the truth and protecting the subject of that truth were no longer the same thing. 3 days later, company headquarters approved the closure of Black Ridge. Marcus attached Elena's report, the toxic gas results, and the safety agency's preliminary assessment. The same investment money that had once been used to pressure everyone into staying on schedule now made the shutdown easier to approve. No insurer wanted to back a project with a deep sinkhole, unidentified underground gases, and a history of 6 men disappearing during a similar incident. Removing the equipment took nearly 2 weeks. Excavators were loaded onto trailers, generators were unbolted from their foundations, and the office containers left the valley one by one. Sector 7 was left alone except for a perimeter fence topped with barbed wire and red signs reading, "Kip out, subsidence hazard." Nobody suggested recovering the lost drill rig, because reaching it would have meant breaking through the stone they had just used to seal the cavity. The workers left Black Ridge carrying different versions of what had happened. Some knew only that shaft number 7 had collapsed because of an underground gas pocket. A few had seen enormous dark shapes moving through the dust but hadn't watched long enough to know what they were. Nolan never asked Jack about the footprints again. Gary never told anyone what Camera 4 had recorded. Silence spread among the people who knew the most without anyone having to issue an official order. They understood that the clearer the story became, the greater the chance someone would return. After what they had seen, none of them wanted to become the person who showed outsiders the way. By the day the final haul truck left the gate, the season's first snow had covered the highest peaks. Jack stood beside his pickup, looking at the empty prefab buildings, the new fence, and the road that had once carried dozens of haul trucks every day. There were no crushers running, no backup alarms from machinery, no engine vibration moving through the valley floor. Elena came out from the checkpoint using crutches, her legs still wrapped but strong enough to carry some weight. She handed Jack a piece of white quartz with a smoky gray streak running through the middle, something she had picked up near the edge of the sinkhole before the area was sealed. She told him he was the only person she knew who could look at a piece of rock like that without thinking first about its mineral value. Jack gave a small laugh, turned it over in his hand, then slipped it into his coat pocket. Marcus had left the mine the day before and requested a transfer out of field operations after the investigation. The internal report listed only management error and incomplete geological assessment. To the rest of the company, Black Ridge was a project abandoned because of subsidence risk, and that explanation was enough for everyone to move on. Before getting into his pickup, Jack looked toward the northern pine slope. A very large, dark figure crossed the opening between two trunks, tall, broad-shouldered, moving upright. The Sasquatch stopped at the edge of the light for several seconds, just long enough for Jack to remember Camera 4 and the Bigfoot dragging the wolf across the gravel. He didn't reach for binoculars, and he didn't call Elena. The Sasquatch turned and disappeared into the forest with barely enough movement to disturb the branches. Years later, Black Ridge no longer appeared on any list of active mineral projects. The records mentioned only unstable geology and dangerous underground gases. The service road deteriorated, drainage ditches collapsed, and young trees grew through sections of gravel that road rollers had once packed hard. Later aerial photographs showed the forest slowly covering the cuts in the mountainside. Jack left industrial security, bought a cabin at the edge of another forest, and kept a copy of the Black Ridge Workplace Safety Report in a drawer beside the piece of quartz Elena had given him on the day the gate closed. The report was full of language about gas pressure, cavity roofs, and load-bearing ground. Not one line said that 4 enormous Sasquatches had walked into the mine site to save the people who had just broken open the place they were protecting. What Jack remembered most was still the wolf. A Sasquatch nearly 10 feet tall had enough strength to drag the body across the gravel yard, yet he hadn't attacked a single worker. He placed the wolf across the boundary at shaft number 7, looked into the camera, and walked away. People had interpreted the act as a threat, sabotage, or some bizarre display. Only after the drill broke through the cave roof did they understand that it might have been the clearest warning the Bigfoot knew how to give. Jack also never claimed to know what lived inside the cavity. He and Elena had only heard shrieks, felt freezing air, smelled decay, and watched how the Sasquatch group reacted when those sounds rose from below. It could have been an unknown cave ecosystem, a species adapted to darkness, or geological effects that frightened people into interpreting them as something alive. Jack didn't need to turn what remained unknown into a conclusion. At the beginning of every winter, when the distant peaks started turning white with snow, Jack often stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and held the quartz up to the light. He couldn't see Black Ridge from his home, but he knew the forest was slowly covering the valley again. The fence would rust, the warning signs would fall, the truck road would disappear beneath grass and roots. Places people had spent years forcing open could be closed again by nature in only a few decades. Jack found comfort in that thought because Black Ridge had taught him that some places had never been waiting for people to discover them. Their boundaries had existed long before the mine, and some living beings understood those boundaries through a kind of memory that needed no maps, contracts, or geological reports. If the Bigfoot group still moved through the Bitterroot forests, Jack hoped nobody would ever capture them as clearly on film as they had been recorded on October 18, 1988. He also hoped nobody would find a footprint good enough to lead the whole world back to Black Ridge. Deep beneath the stone that had sealed the cavity again, Whatever had made those shrieking sounds in the darkness might still be there. Above ground, the pine forest kept growing, snow kept covering the slopes, and somewhere between the trees, those giant guardians might still move quietly through the wilderness, protecting a boundary people only understood after they nearly destroyed it. This is a fictional story we created from old wilderness legends about the ancient boundary between people and the natural world. What stays with me isn't the size of the Sasquatch caught on camera, it's the message he was trying to deliver. People drove enormous drills into the earth because there was money beneath it. But sometimes what we nearly uncover is far beyond anything modern technology can control. That wolf wasn't dragged to shaft number 7 as a threat. It was a warning, delivered in the clearest language that Sasquatch had available before the real disaster began. If you had been Jack or Elena that night, would you have had the courage to shut down a multi-million-dollar project and keep the forest boundary secret? Or would you have released the footage for the entire world to see? Tell me which choice you would make in the comments below. I'll see you next week for another story from Bigfoot Sasquatch Stories.